everyone, my name is Dr. Ty-Ria Jenkins, and today I'm sharing my district data project. This work really reflects both my academic learning and my lived experiences in schools. Throughout my career, I've seen data used in a lot of different ways, sometimes effectively, but often in ways that felt surface level or disconnected from actual instruction. I've sat in meetings where we looked at numbers, but there wasn't always a clear next step. And I've also seen the frustration from teachers when data felt like one more thing instead of a tool to support their practice. So as I developed this project, I really centered my thinking on how we move from just collecting and reviewing data to actually using it to drive meaningful and equitable change for our students. This project is grounded in the 10 steps that shape my data action plan. What I appreciated about this framework is that it gave me structure, but it also pushed me to be intentional at every stage. In my experience, when there isn't a clear process, data conversations can become reactive instead of strategic. These steps help me to think through not just what to do, but why it matters and how it connects to the outcome for students. More importantly, it kept equity at the center. Every step required me to think about how decisions would impact not just the overall student population, but specifically those subgroups that are often underserved. I started by defining a clear and measurable research question focused on subgroup performance. One thing I've learned is that if your question is too broad, your work becomes unfocused. In my experience, working with schools, I've seen how easy it is to say, we want to improve student achievement, but that doesn't give you direction. So I intentionally focused on how a structured district-wide data review and intervention process impacts students' performance, especially for our ATSI subgroups. This matters to me because I've seen how those subgroups can get lost in overall averages. A school might look like it's doing well holistically, but when you dig deeper, there are clear gaps. I wanted to make sure the question pushed us to confront that reality and respond to it. When determining the population and sample, I focused specifically on schools identified with ATSI subgroups. Being that I'm a continuous improvement coordinator in my school district, a lot of my work centers around supporting those schools with increasing student achievement for all students. So the decision came directly from my experience. I've worked in spaces where decisions were made based on overall data, and it didn't always reflect what certain groups of students were experiencing. So for me, this step was about being intentional, making sure the data actually represented the students who needed the most support. It also reinforced the importance of disaggregating data. When we take the time to look at different student groups, it changes the conversation. It shifts the focus from general improvement to targeted, meaningful support. When selecting the schools to work with, of course, I started out by looking at our schools who are currently ATSI schools, but also talking with principals about plans of having these quarterly assessments and mock tests to kind of get a feel for what buy-in would look like. Actually, one of the principals at Warrenville Elementary School approached me and said that she was all on board. She was ready to begin the process and pilot it with her third through fifth grade team, since those are the students who take the state assessment. And she actually has some of her colleagues or peers at the three other schools at Gloverville, Chilton Creek, and North Aiken who also wanted to be a part of the focus group. So really after sharing it, because all schools were aware, these four, because I know that they have a collegial type of relationship, but also I think with them kind of being buddies and kind of having commonalities among different, of course, among the designation, but also with their population of pupils in poverty, the part of the county that they're in. which ranges in different in different areas, but they were want to work together to be able to um, share best practices and see, how this could better support them. So that was kind of really how the four schools were selected. I shared it with all of our schools, which was about 14 elementary schools that are currently ATSI schools, and these four schools were the ones who reached out. Just to give you some background as well, the district had done benchmarks before. This is my second year actually working in South Carolina and being with this specific school district. And they had did benchmarks in the past, but then they have kind of gotten away from doing benchmarks, and everyone was creating their own common formative assessments or their own benchmarks. So when it came to kind of gauging where they were, it was like comparing apples to oranges instead of apples to apples in terms of looking at it as a district approach. So this was a project of mine, just to see, where we can get with having a group of focus schools, um, with being able to kind of have some of those common benchmark assessments to be able to compare. Also, it can build that collective efficacy, not just within their buildings, but across those schools, with those teachers also being able to collaborate with each other based off of their data, and for those principals to be able to support each other as well. So this was really an opportunity for me to see where the district was in terms of administering these assessments and seeing how could this best be scaffolded to be able to support a district-wide approach from this particular focus group. Next, I selected data sources like quarterly assessment and district dashboards. This was easy for me to be able to support, as the quarterly assessments were collaboratively built between the teachers, with me kind of being a support in terms of ensuring that um, the questions and items that we were selecting to be part of the bank were aligned to the standards, and that they were meeting the rigor of what students would see on SE Ready, which is the state assessment. So one of the platforms in which we decided to use to be able to support um, was Coach Digital Compass. Um, which is an online data resource to where it has built-in supports for students where they can see test item like questions to be able to get familiar with their format, in addition to being able to create like assessments within the platform. It was kind of twofold uh, area of mine that I wanted to be able to support and increase usage within this platform, as I'm also working within the federal programs department. And this was one of our resources that was being currently paid for, but teachers weren't using it to the degree of which it could be used. And I guess that also fell back on um, them just not knowing the different components and tiered scaffolds that was provided in the resource. So also providing that professional development there so that they can see how much of a help it can be, not only for assessments, but also for filling gaps with instruction and, for test prep. So it was twofold for me with pushing this resource, but also having that background knowledge of knowing too that it's directly aligned and supports what students will see for testing. So, in my experience, one of the biggest challenges when introducing new tools is that, of course, like I shared, teachers, don't have time to learn it, or with trusting, or with thinking like, hey, this is another thing that's being pushed out for us to use. So I combated that by ensuring that I was an active part of the process. So it wasn't something that was added to their plate, and also their input was valued, and they were able to share. Now, did they know the exact questions that were going to be chosen? No, but they were able to kind of give what they would suggest as a bank, individually and collectively, and then I compiled and actually created the assessment. And because I created it at the district level, then all schools were able to see those same questions. So it wouldn't be like a comparing apples to oranges situation in terms of this focus school had these questions, this focus school had these questions. They all had the same questions to be able to look at. Um, I've also seen how, inconsistent or unreliable data can create confusion and even resistance. So this step was really about ensuring that the data we use is accurate, is aligned, and is actually helpful with guiding instruction. Because a big component within this resource too that I provided professional development on after we had our first quarter assessment is this actual resource provides next step for each student independently for what to do next based off of their performance, what how they did on that assessment. Here are the gaps, and it gives you a personalized pathway for each of those students. We then took it further to say, okay, well, it's giving us some for individual students. Let's look and see if we have any students who have common lessons that are going to be those gap fillers, because then you can redeliver some of that information in small group. How about if majority has the specific lesson that they need to go back and review? Then that's something that you can go and have a whole group lesson on, and it provides you the resources for it. And it kind of operates on that gradual release model with the I do, you do, we do, which teachers were familiar with because that's a framework which is used within the district. So just by being able to meet them where they are and show them that how to better use the resources to support them, and let them know that it's not an extra thing for them to do, and them being able to see that alignment created major buy-in within those teachers. Because like I said, it was just piloted with 3 through 5. But then we had teachers in second grade and first grade saying, hey, can we start doing these benchmarks? Hey, we've heard about the different data digs that you guys have done. I wonder, can we do these with our students? So word of mouth from the teachers, and they're your best sellers of what it is that you're trying to push out, as long as they can see how it works and how it will benefit them. So by doing some things on the front end to take away from teachers having to spend a bunch of time doing it on the back end, provided an easy access point for them to be able to use this data source and use it effectively. Planning for ethical data collection was also really important to me. As educators and leaders, we are responsible for protecting student information while also using it to make decisions. In my experience, sometimes the urgency to improve outcomes can cause us to overlook the importance of how data is handled and shared. This step reminded me to be intentional about maintaining confidentiality and ensuring that data conversations remain respectful and student-centered. It also reinforced the importance of creating a culture where data is used to support, not blame. A big component, as I shared with you previously, of this data project was using the data source coach digital compass. Teachers were a part of the collaborative efforts to create a bank of test item questions for the quarter and mock test um, assessments. However, I was the one who put it together and had access to be able to see district-wide data. Schools can see their own personal data in terms of the instructional coach and principal can see all the teachers' data within their school, but then the teachers can only see their individual class data. Um, if they wanted to see other teachers' data, they would have to speak with that teacher in terms of being able to see it, or wait till we had our collaborative data days and we kind of drilled down. But student information was kept confidential within that platform and resource. And as we began to dive into the data and talk about those areas of growth and opportunity for students, teachers will reflect within their platform and look at student scores and We will talk about where students were, what mastery would look like, how we can support them with being able to get there, um, and not playing once again that blame game of, well, we only have 20% of students in this class at mastery, or we only have 60% of this class at mastery. But this is what the data tells us. So what is it that we need to do next? Cleaning and organizing the data was honestly one of the most impactful steps. I've been in meetings where teams spend more time trying to figure out the data than actually analyzing it. So for me, this step was about setting the foundation. If the data isn't clean and organized, then everything that comes after it is compromised. Taking the time to prepare the data ensures that when teams come together, they can focus on what really matters, understanding student needs and planning for next steps. The great thing about it is the data source that we use um, has the data aligned by student name, but there are different functions within the platform to where you can have it to sort by name, you can have it to sort by score on a specific question. You can look at even within it if how many students skipped this question um, initially when it came to it on the assessment and came back. So the data source gave a lot of information. Allowing teachers to be able to explore it and also show how you can navigate the different functions was very impactful with being able to have those data conversations. The first one, it took a little longer than the following as teachers were getting used to using the interface, and I was kind of giving real time PD on how you can go in and navigate the platform in terms of looking at the data. But as we got into the second and the third and the mock test assessment, with them being able to um, analyze it, they were already on it. They already had um, their data sheets completely filled out. It went partially filled out. Teachers were ready to tell me what all they were already doing to intervene prior to us drilling down and looking at where those students' interventions were together. So they became more confident in themselves. So it shifted from me really kind of being the leader of those conversations to taking on a role of just being there as a support and hearing those conversations and them already telling me what it is that they are doing to kind of support those students based off of what the data it had shown. So that was very impactful as well. When choosing statistical methods, I focused on what would be most practical in a school setting. In my experience, it's not about using the most complex methods. It's about using methods that educators can understand and apply. So I focus on approaches that will clearly show trends, highlight gaps, and support decision making. And this step really pushed me to think about accessibility. If the data isn't understandable, then it wouldn't be used effectively. So when we first began doing our quarterly data digs, especially since it was something new, I didn't want to overwhelm teachers. I went with using whatever the school-based data protocol was that they have already had in play, whether they were using it in their PLCs or in their data meetings. So we kind of used what was already in place, their school-specific data protocol. If they didn't have a data protocol, then at those particular schools, we'll talk through it. And I brought an example template, and we still kind of followed it and went through questions to be able to guide the conversation. It shifted by the quarter two assessment and, of course, for the mock assessment to using the data protocol to the right, as you will see on your screen, where it was more specific in terms of pulling out subgroup data, so that teachers are being able to look at their class as a whole, but also key into the subgroup performance. So as we're planning, we're keeping all students at the forefront, and we're also being intentional about the progress monitoring of those subgroups, because some of those subgroups are what have some of those schools having that ATSI designation. which means there's a gap in their subgroup performance and their school-wide performance. So that was important. In addition to having the plan and the action component at the end of this template, to where to where teachers are analyzing where student work, looking for growth, looking for misconceptions, and then action planning for what those next steps would be. During the analysis phase, I focus on identifying both overall trends and subgroup disparities. This is where the work becomes real. I've seen how powerful it can be when teams come together and truly engage with data. When teachers and leaders collaborate, they begin to ask deeper questions and make stronger connections to instruction. This step is not just about numbers, it's about understanding what those numbers are telling us about student experiences. So each of the 4 schools that I supported, once the quarter assessment or mock assessment was given, we set out a specific time for me to come back and for us to have a data dig, a grade level data dig together, where we will look at the data, talk about student work samples, look at what those misconceptions are, and go ahead and actively plan for how we was going to support those students who still needed support in terms of mastery, but also um, aligning so that teachers are still keeping up with pacing of teaching those new skills. And that was something that was a big area of focus because a lot of teachers were getting off pacing because they were seeing the scores to where some of the students were, and they were reteaching, and reteaching it the same way, but not necessarily having different strategies. Some teachers were accustomed to doing whole group the whole time and hadn't necessarily introduced small groups. Some were only working in small groups. So a lot of the work with supporting them there came with meeting them where they are, whether they had already created a structure for small groups, or looking at their schedule and kind of time stamping it so that they can maximize their instructional time with being able to support those students. And being shoulder to shoulder support, so being able to come in and model what that would look like, and receive feedback from the teachers and questions that they may have had about, why did you choose to model it this way, or what made you feel that this was a sufficient amount of time for this particular activity. So this was when being strategic about the timing of maximizing the instructional block came into play, which was a result of data analysis and looking at where students were, and for teachers to feel vulnerable and be honest about, hey, I'm getting off pacing because I feel like, I still have students who haven't mastered the skill, and I need support with being able to keep up with pacing, but also having opportunities to support students with remediation, and also those students who already have it with enriching them where they are. So those were some of the things that came out of our data analysis meetings as well. Interpreting the results is where the data really starts to come alive. In my experience, data by itself doesn't drive change. Interpretation does. This is where we ask, what does this mean for our students? What does this mean for our instruction? This step helped me connect the data to real classroom practices and leadership decisions. It's where we move from analysis to action. A big component that was impactful for teachers to be able to kind of stumble upon as we began doing the quarterly mock assessments and doing the data digs behind them is the conversations that we will have in the data analysis meeting. We're looking at the questions and talking about misconceptions that students would have. Well, when we did the first quarter assessment, students weren't necessarily having to turn in their scratch paper. So when we will have conversations, a lot of it will be based off of what teachers assume those misconceptions were. So as we began to talk through it, and then It was one question that I asked that was like, well, how do you know that that was their misconception? And the room got silent. That's when we began to see that, hey, why not have a student answer sheet so that we can actually look at the student work samples and see specifically where they struggle? Because that would give us more to go off of, and we know specifically where that student struggle was. And so that was something that we started to implement with having, and you'll see it on the left side of your screen there, having an actual answer sheet where students will record and having it numbered so we can know, because you know how students, how kiddos are. Sometimes they bounce around the paper as they're working their questions out, but we want to be more intentional about it so we can see the specifics for the question. We did also talk about how that's different from how students may see um, their scratch paper in terms of on the state assessment, because it's going to be just a blank sheet of paper or a grid paper, but it's not going to be numbered. However, the state assessment is from one snapshot in time to see where students are. We're actually using these assessments to inform instruction so that we can go back and either remediate or enrich those students. So we decided on having a student answer sheet that was numbered so we could be more intentional when we were going through doing the data analysis process. Also to the right, what you'll see is a template that supports teacher with planning after the interpretation of results. So now that we've looked at where students are, we looked at their work samples to see where those misconceptions lie. What is it that we're going to do? Because it also supports, as I mentioned earlier, them being able to stay on pacing with the new standard and indicators that they're currently teaching, but also being strategic about what standard or indicators are they spiraling. What is that weekly assessment going to look like? So doing that kind of backwards by design. What resources are you going to use to support um, the instruction? And how can you intentionally plan for a small group? So these resources help with the interpretation of data to ensure that we were being strategic and responsive to the actual needs of the students and also to the needs of the teachers by having a planning template that allowed them and supported them with being able to stay on pacing as they also remediate and enrich for previously taught standard and indicators. Developing actionable recommendations is one of the most critical steps. I've seen plans that identify gaps but don't clearly outline what to do next. So I focused on creating targeted, realistic strategies that teachers and leaders could actually implement. These recommendations are directly tied to the data and focus on both subgroup and whole class support. This step reflects my belief that data should always lead to action. So when meeting with each of the schools as we did our data analysis of the assessments, I always left them with planning questions and next steps and work time to be able to work through these questions and be able to have me there as a thought partner with bouncing ideas in terms of what would this look like. If you have 80% mastery, you have 20% of your students who still need support. What happens if it's the reverse? You have 20% that masters and you have 80% who are still struggling. So by having these guiding questions to not necessarily tell teachers where to go next, but to actually provide a springboard for them to be able to think and consider, how am I going to approach this to support students and meet them where they are? Was very impactful. Finally, communication is key. I've learned that even the best data analysis won't make an impact if it's not communicated clearly. So this plan emphasizes using visual, structured protocols, and collaborative conversations to ensure that all stakeholders understand the data and feel empowered to act on it. It's about creating a shared understanding and a shared responsibility for student success. The principals at the focus schools have had a meeting where we've sat down, even the instructional coaches were invited, and we talked about the impact of having these assessments, got feedback on what teachers are seeing, got feedback on what other grade levels within their school were seeing, about how they want to too be able to kind of model the same process. Um, the coaches were saying how they felt that now that they've seen it modeled, they'll be able to, lead those conversations going forward in the year to come. So that was very heartwarming to be able to hear that they feel comfortable being able to, guide those conversations. And then also extending it beyond just those tested grade levels to all grade levels. And extending it beyond just quarterly assessment to looking at those weekly assessments and doing the same thing. Um, on April the 14th, this will actually be shared at our instructional retreat with our Chief Officer of Instruction, some of our content interventionists who are at our district level, um, with how the plan has rolled out, telling them about the strengths in the plan, what were some areas that may need to be tweaked, and providing the data to support, the implementation of these schools that participated within the focus group. So that is yet to come and will actually be this coming Tuesday. Part of this coming Tuesday's meeting will include the sharing of data for these particular schools. If you look at the table that I have in front of you, you'll be able to see that those top 4 schools are those focus schools. And based off of our district universal screener, which is already where students take the beginning, middle, and end of the year assessment, this captures how the students in grade levels 3, 4, and 5, so those tested grade levels performed on their end of the year assessment, which was taken prior to spring break, and their projected proficiency for how they performed on the end of the year assessment with iReady and how that will correlate to their projected proficiency on SC Ready. So we're looking at those schools for the 4 focus schools, and I have it listed for you by level. Level 4 is exceeds, level 3 is meets, level 2 is approaching, level 1 is does not meet. In order to be proficient, you have to get either a level 3 or a level 4. And those percentages are listed there. I also wanted so that you can have a comparison to be able to see as other elementary schools within the district who are also ATSI and their percentages and where they were. Some key ones that I want you to look at is for AES, which has with proficiency being at level 3 or above is 57%. Also, BEES with being 62% or above, and EASOA being at 56%. Those 3 schools are excellent schools based off of their school report card. And if you look at CCES and you look at GLES and you look at WES, who were 3 of the 4 of the focus schools, their percentages are not too far off from those schools who are currently excellent schools within our school district, with these schools coming in at being a good or average school. So that is phenomenal with being able to see that their scores are not that far off from those schools. Also, we're looking at the schools that were within the focus group. Their populations are different, a little different in terms of their poverty index are much higher than some of the schools within those other districts. But I thought, I'm sorry, some of those other schools that are within the district. But I just wanted to be able to share these findings with you and have this comparison for you to be able to see how those schools performed on that end of the year test and their projected proficiency on SC rating in comparison to one another. All of these steps came together in my district data action plan. The plan started with developing a structured data review protocol, then moved into analyzing quarterly data in focus schools, creating targeted interventions, and monitoring progress over time. This reflected what I've seen work in practice. Starting small, building consistency, and then scaling across the district. The long-term goal is to create a system where data use is not an event, but a routine part of how schools operate. Overall, this project has really strengthened my understanding of what it means to lead with data. It's not just about analysis, it's about action, equity, and sustainability. It reaffirmed for me that when data is used intentionally and collaboratively, it has the power to transform outcomes for students. Thank you.